Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're taking on a huge historical investigation, one that really stretches across half a millennium.
It's a big one.
It is. Our destination is the modern-day Nordic model, that unique economic structure you find in Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland.
And our mission really is to trace this incredibly complex, often contradictory, and definitely not a straight line history of collectivist thought in Europe.
Exactly. To ultimately answer the question, how did these five countries manage to forge what people call a third way?
A path that, was completely distinct from the revolutionary communism of the East, but also from the kind of high-risk, low-safety net capitalism you see in, say, the U.S. or the U.K.
And the sources we've got here, they really demand we look past the surface stuff. The free healthcare, the generous parental leave, and actually focus on the deep historical compromises that created them.
Right. And the core thesis that comes out of all this is, I think, genuinely surprising for a lot of people. The Nordic model isn't socialism in the classic, Marxist sense.
Not at all.
It's more of a radical institutional choice to domesticate capitalism. It didn't get rid of the market. It built this incredibly rigorous, legally binding cage around it.
A cage designed for what, exactly?
A cage designed specifically to enforce universal social rights and to, comprehensively manage risk for every single citizen.
That distinction, domestication, not abolition, that is so crucial. We aren't just here to summarize policy. We are going to trace this philosophy from a 16th century satirical novel.
All the way through the bloody splits of the 20th century.
Right. And we're looking for those aha moments.
Yeah.
The specific treaties, the philosophical turns, the political bargains that explain why the life of a person in Oslo or Helsinki is just structurally different from someone's in Boston or Berlin.
We want to understand why they define risk the way they do, why they define freedom the way they do, and, why their welfare systems are built this way.
So let's unpack this. Let's start at the very, very beginning of the critique. Okay, so our journey starts in 1516 with a book written by a brilliant Catholic lawyer named Sir Thomas More, who, incidentally, was later executed for treason.
Not a happy ending for him.
No, but the book is Utopia. And it's really the first systematic exploration of a society built on communal principles in the Western canon. And it wasn't just some fantasy, it was a direct response to massive social upheaval.
The context is absolutely everything here. More was writing against the backdrop of the Enclosure Acts in Tudor England.
And this wasn't just some minor policy change.
Oh, no. It was a full-blown economic revolution, and it was driven by pure greed.
Right.
Wealthy landowners were literally fencing off the common lands, the fields and forests that had sustained the English peasantry for centuries.
To do what with them?
To graze sheep. It was all about wool production, which was incredibly profitable. But the process was socially brutal. It just destroyed traditional rural life and created this huge new landless class of, vagrants and beggars.
The sources use that phrase, sheep-devouring men, which is it's a perfect, terrifying way to put it.
It is.
Yeah.
And More saw the legal system itself being used as a weapon to make this injustice happen.
So he took all that systemic violence and injustice, and he laid out a critique that has remained the bedrock of anti-capitalist thought ever since.
He did. His central argument was that private property is the fundamental root of all social problems. And he wasn't just saying it causes problems. He was arguing that it fundamentally corrupts human nature itself.
So it's not just an economic argument, it's a moral one.
It's a deep moral and psychological argument. His claim, and it's highlighted in the sources, is that a corrupt moral nature cannot cherish what is private without detriment to what is common. He basically reframed things like greed and theft, not as individual moral failures, but as predictable, rational responses to an economic structure designed for private gain.
That is a huge shift, right? Blaming the system, not the person. So how did he build this out in his fictional island of Utopia? What did he actually propose to, dismantle the greed machine?
He proposed a total takedown of it, far beyond just, say, redistributing wealth. Take currency. They had no money in Utopia. And gold, the ultimate symbol of European wealth, was deliberately made worthless.
How?
The sources tell us it was used only for chamber pots, or for the chains they put on slaves.
Wow.
Yeah. And this wasn't just a joke. It was a deep psychological critique. By forcing citizens to only see gold when dealing with, bodily functions or the lowest members of society, he was trying to literally rewire the human brain to see it as disgusting and valueless.
That detail about the gold chamber pots is so visceral. It's what makes the critique stick. You're culturally abolishing greed.
Exactly. But we have to be clear, Utopia was far from a modern liberal democracy. As radical as his property critique was, his society was deeply contradictory, authoritarian even.
It was pre-modern agrarian.
And the biggest contradiction we just can't overlook is its reliance on forced labor. Utopia was not an equal society. It depended on slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals to do all the dirty work.
Which right there disqualifies it from being any kind of ancestor to democratic socialism.
Absolutely.
So if the model itself was so flawed authoritarian, dependent on slaves, why do later thinkers like Karl Kautsky and even Lenin see this text as so foundational? What's the real legacy of utopia?
The legacy is purely conceptual. It reframed what was politically possible. Before More, poverty was just sort of accepted as God's will, a permanent feature of life.
Right, the way things are.
More completely challenged that. He presented poverty and injustice as a consequence of man-made legal arrangements, what he called the conspiracy of the rich. He proved that another way of organizing society was at least imaginable.
So the idea that the economic structure itself produces how we think and behave.
Exactly. It's a proto-materialist argument, and it's critical for everything that comes after. It gives the intellectual ammunition to the next wave of thinkers.
Which brings us to the Enlightenment, which was fighting for a very different kind of freedom.
Yes, the 18th century was all about securing political rights. The French Revolution in 1789, it secured political equality, overthrowing the monarchy, establishing citizenship, though, mostly for men who owned property.
But for the radicals, that wasn't nearly enough.
Not even close. For the radical fringes, this was profoundly inadequate.
And this is where we get the link from More's communalism to the industrial age.
Precisely. You see it with Gracchus Babeuf and his Conspiracy of Equals in the late 1790s. They argued really fiercely that political equality, the right to vote, was totally meaningless without economic equality.
So they connected the dots.
It did. They took More's idea that the fruits of the earth belong to everyone and applied it to the new industrial concerns. Babeuf's movement, of course, failed spectacularly. He was executed. But he formalized the next great argument. The battle wasn't just for political rights anymore, but for economic justice. And that realization leads us right into the fire of the Industrial Revolution.
The sources call this next group the utopian socialists. And they were, really, the direct moral reaction to the sheer scale of human suffering from early industrialization. I mean, the brutal slums, the 14-hour workdays, child labor.
It was horrific. And Marx, later dismissed them as naive. But they were the pioneers. They were trying to solve a problem that nobody in human history had ever faced before. They were looking for a rational or maybe a moral solution to this industrial cruelty.
But their solutions were all over the place.
Wildly different, yeah. It really reflected their own backgrounds. Let's start with Henri de Saint-Simon. He was an engineer, a technocrat. He looked at society not as a moral problem, but as a vast, inefficient machine.
So he didn't want to smash the machine. He just wanted to redesign it. And his big conflict wasn't rich versus poor. It was bees versus drones.
Exactly. He put everyone into two camps. The bees were the productive people, workers, engineers, scientists, factory owners, the people actually creating value. And the drones were the parasites. The old nobility, the clergy, the landowners who just collected rent, people who extracted wealth without creating anything.
I can see the direct line back to More's Conspiracy of the Rich, but St. Simon's solution feels much more modern.
Oh, absolutely. His solution was pure technocracy. He envisioned society as a vast workshop directed by a council of scientists and industrialists. The goal was state planning, the administration of things, to replace the chaos of the free market with a rational, scientifically managed system.
For him, the market was just irrational.
Utterly.
Okay, so we go from the engineer to the architect of passion, Charles Fourier. He takes us into a completely different realm, one of psychological liberation.
Fourier is maybe the strangest and honestly the most fascinating of them all. He hated what he called the chicanery of commerce, and he saw civilization itself as this machine for repressing our natural human passions.
But he was also sharp economically.
Very sharp. He was one of the first to analyze the weird contradictions of capitalism. He had this famous line, "Poverty is born of superabundance itself."
He's talking about the crisis of overproduction.
Exactly. Factories are churning out goods that the workers who made them can't afford to buy. So you have warehouses full of stuff right next to people who are starving and have nothing.
And his solution, the phalanstery, sounds like something from a sci-fi novel. It's literally an architectural fix for a social problem.
It was. It was supposed to be this single, massive, palace-like building for exactly 1,620 people. He called it a passional series. The key idea was that if you let people express their passions freely, work stops being a chore and becomes a pleasure.
And he achieved this through radical job rotation.
Yes, workers would change tasks every couple of hours. You'd go from the garden to the kitchen to the factory floor, making sure your work always aligned with whatever you were passionate about in that moment.
Wait. Rotating jobs every few hours based on your mood? Can you imagine trying to run payroll for that?
Yeah.
Or just scheduling production? It sounds gloriously chaotic.
It does sound like a complete fantasy, but the philosophy behind it was serious. The idea that human labor should be joyful and fulfilling, not something monotonous that's forced on you.
And we can't skip over his other major contribution.
No, can't. He was a really important feminist pioneer. He actually coined the term feminism and argued that the degree of women's emancipation was the true measure of a society's freedom. He drew a direct line there.
Incredible for the 1820s. Okay, so now from the grand theory of the phalanstery to the ultimate pragmatist, Robert Owen. He was different because he wasn't just drawing up plans, he was actually doing it.
Owen was a wealthy Welsh textile manufacturer, and his whole philosophy was based on this intense belief in environmental determinism. His motto was, man's character is made for him, not by him.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning he completely rejected the idea that people were morally flawed. If his workers were drunk or lazy, it was because their environment, the slum, the factory, rationally produced that behavior. Change the environment, and you change the person.
And he set out to prove this at his new Lanark cotton mills in Scotland. To prove that better conditions meant better people and, this is the critical part, better business.
And he did. He turned New Lanark into a model community. He cut the workday from 14 hours to 10.5. He banned child labor. He set up the first infant schools in Britain, provided clean housing.
And the key takeaway from the sources
is that he did all of this and stayed profitable. He proved empirically that you didn't have to choose between benevolence and efficiency. This just blew the minds of the established capitalist order.
a huge piece of evidence for reformers. And yet he's often remembered for his big failure. The radical communist community he tried to set up later, New Harmony in Indiana. What happened there?
The failure of New Harmony really shows the limits of the whole utopian strategy, and it's the perfect pivot point to Marx. Owen, for all his success, still believed in the power of pure reason. He thought if he could just build a few of these perfect little villages...
The world's leaders would just see how great it was and copy him.
Exactly. Kings, parliaments, industrialists, they'd all see the light and voluntarily adopt his system.
So the flaw wasn't the idea, it was the strategy.
Precisely. The strategy rejected politics. It rejected class struggle. They saw the working class not as a revolutionary agent that could seize power, but as this passive, suffering group that needed to be saved by enlightened elites.
And New Harmony fell apart.
It disintegrated
Yeah.
because it was totally dependent on Owen's money, and it ignored the political and economic reality of the American market all around it. They were trying to build a new society out of a void, appealing to a morality that the ruling class just didn't care about. And that philosophical vacuum is exactly what Marx was about to fill. So 1848, the Communist Manifesto is published, and this marks the decisive split. Socialism stops being about morally saying how society should be, which is the utopian approach, and starts being about analytically predicting how society must evolve. That's the scientific approach.
And this whole shift hinges on one core concept: historical materialism. We need to spend a minute here because this is the theoretical foundation for the next 100 years of struggle. Let's break that down.
Okay, so historical materialism is the theory that the engine of history isn't ideas or great men or religion. It's the way a society organizes its material survival.
How it makes its stuff.
Basically, yeah. Marx argued that the mode of production, the economic base, which is the factories and land and the relationships, like capitalist versus worker, that base conditions the entire social superstructure. Law, politics, culture, all of it.
So if I'm getting this right, it's like, tell me how a society produces its food and goods, and I can tell you everything about its politics and its philosophy.
That's a great way to put it. And crucially, this system has internal contradictions, a dialectic. Capitalism, for example, needed to centralize workers in factories, which created the proletariat. At the same time, it suffered from these crises of overproduction that Fourier spotted.
So capitalism wasn't just morally bad, it was scientifically doomed.
In their view, yes. It was a historical necessity that created both the conditions and the agent, the working class, for its own inevitable destruction.
Which is the huge shift. The focus moves from building model villages to organizing the working class to seize political power on an international scale.
Exactly. And that organizational effort led to the Second International from 1889 to 1916. This is a coordinating body for these powerful, disciplined socialist parties all over Europe. The biggest one was the German Social Democratic Party, the SPD.
And they were successful. They got things done.
They did. They achieved major reforms. The fight for the 8-hour day, making May Day an international workers' holiday, that came from them. They built these huge political machines, almost like states within a state, with their own unions, newspapers, cultural groups.
But that success created its own huge problem, didn't it?
It did. A massive internal contradiction. The theory, the orthodoxy from Marx, said that capitalism was always on the verge of a big collapse, which would require a revolution. But the reality in the late 19th century was, well, things were stabilizing.
Living standards were actually going up for a lot of workers.
They were. And more people were getting the right to vote, so workers had a voice in parliament. The revolutionary fire just seemed to be dying down.
And this observation led to what was called the revisionist heresy, spelled out by Edward Bernstein.
Bernstein was a leader in the SPD, living in exile, and he just looked at the data. Wages were rising, the middle class was growing, the state wasn't collapsing. And he concluded that the Marxist prediction of this inevitable catastrophic collapse was just wrong.
And his book, Evolutionary Socialism, just blew things up.
It was an absolute bombshell in 1899 because it directly attacked the theoretical pillars of the entire movement.
So if capitalism wasn't going to collapse, what was his strategy? Where should socialists put their energy?
He argued that parliamentary democracy offered a real, non-violent way to gradually transform society. Why wait for some bloody, unpredictable revolution when you could get real reforms, higher wages, more voting rights, factory laws right now?
Which led to his most famous and most controversial statement.
The goal is nothing, the movement is everything. The idea was that the day-to-day struggle for concrete improvements was the socialist project, not waiting for some distant revolutionary apocalypse.
That idea, reform over revolution, that's the fundamental split, isn't it, between communists and social democrats. But if the orthodox Marxists hated him for it, and they called him a traitor, how did this heretical idea end up capturing the Scandinavian movements?
Because it just fit their reality perfectly. Sweden, Denmark, Norway, they weren't czarist Russia. They had functioning, evolving democracies. Their labor movements were already super pragmatic, focused on building power locally and winning concessions now. Bernstein just gave them the intellectual justification for what they were already doing.
So when the big split came, they were already on that path.
They'd already internalized it. And that great schism became permanent because of two events around World War I.
The first being the war itself.
Yes. The Second International just fell apart. The big socialist parties, especially in Germany, chose nationalism over international working class solidarity and voted to fund the war, a huge betrayal of Marxist principles. And then, in 1917, the Russian Revolution happened.
The ultimate test case for the revolutionary path.
It was. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin, seized power and immediately doubled down on the vanguard revolutionary model. They created the Third International, and they called themselves communists. And that became the model. Anti-parliamentary, anti-democratic, and totally willing to use state terror to get what they wanted.
So what happened to the people who rejected Lenin's path, the ones who still believed in democracy and civil liberties?
They regrouped and cemented their identity as social democrats. They were committed to the parliamentary road, to transforming the state from within through universal welfare and economic regulation.
And the Nordic countries went all in on that path.
Unequivocally, they'd already been primed by Bernstein's thinking. And that choice, made right after 1917, is the single most important moment. It defined the Nordic divergence and set them on a course to domesticate the market, not destroy it.
Okay, so now we're leaving the big philosophical debates and getting into the nitty-gritty of pragmatic politics. The Nordic Social Democrats had their ideology reform, not revolution. But they needed a political framework that could actually work, that could survive crises and unite different classes. And this starts in Sweden with the concept of folkhemmet.
The people's home.
Exactly.
Folkhemmet was, it was the rhetorical and political genius of Per Albin Hansson, the leader of the Swedish Social Democrats. He laid it out in 1928
It was just a masterstroke of political branding.
How so?
He took the symbol of the home, which is this conservative, safe, warm symbol, and he consciously filled it with social democratic ideas.
And what was the argument of this new national home?
Hansen said the nation should be like a family. And in a good home, there are no privileged children and no neglected children. The society they had, torn apart by class conflict, was a bad home. The Social Democrats, he said, would build a good home. They would replace class struggle with cooperation and mutual responsibility.
Which is how you get the middle class to buy into high taxes and universal programs.
Precisely.
A brilliant rhetorical move. But how did they turn that, sentimental vision into a hard economic reality that actually changed the relationship between capital and labor?
That came 10 years later with the Socialism Agreement of 1938. And this wasn't a law passed by Parliament. This was a foundational treaty signed between the two most powerful groups in Sweden, the Trade Union Confederation, LO, and the Employers Association, SAF.
It sounds less like a law and more like a peace treaty after a very long war.
That's a great way to think about it. It was the constitution of the Swedish labor market.
So what were the terms? What did each side give up to get this industrial peace?
Huge concessions on both sides. The employers, SAF, permanently recognized the union's right to organize and bargain collectively. No more interference. In return, the unions, LO, formally recognized the employer's right to manage the business, to hire, fire, and make investment decisions. It was a clear division of power that ended the constant strikes and lockouts.
But if you move that power away from the government, doesn't that make the system really vulnerable? What if the employers just decide to walk away from the deal?
It creates a risk, sure, but the deal has lasted because it benefits both sides. It created stability, which is good for long-term planning and competing globally. And this decentralization is what explains that really unique detail about Sweden.
Which is?
They have no statutory minimum wage law.
That is always the most surprising fact. If the state doesn't set a minimum wage, who does?
The social partners. Wages, hours, conditions. It's all set by collective agreements between the unions and the employer groups. And because union coverage is so high, around 65%, those agreements basically set a high wage floor for the entire economy.
And this system supported what they called the solidarity wage policy.
Right, which sounds like a paradox, but is brilliant.
Yeah.
The policy was essentially equal pay for equal work across all industries, no matter how profitable a specific company was.
So workers in the really successful companies agreed not to take the maximum wage they could have gotten.
Yes, to show solidarity. But, more importantly, it meant that low-profit, inefficient companies had to pay the same high wages as their competitors. This forced them to either invest in new technology to become more productive or go out of business.
So it's a constant engine of creative destruction.
Exactly. It ensured the whole Swedish economy stayed highly productive, not just a few high-tech sectors.
A really sophisticated way to combine social justice and economic dynamism. Okay, moving over to Denmark, they had a similar compromise, but it was driven by the Great Depression, specifically in agriculture.
That's the Kanslergate Agreement of 1933. It was a huge political trade-off, born out of necessity. You have the Social Democrats, who represented city workers, making a deal with the Liberal Party, who represented rural farmers, their traditional enemies.
What was the trade? What did the city workers give the farmers?
The Social Democrats agreed to devalue the currency. That immediately made Danish farm exports cheaper and saved the farmers from ruin. In exchange, the Liberals agreed to a massive expansion of public works, unemployment subsidies, and social services. This was the moment the Social Democrats locked in their power.
And the most important philosophical idea they locked in was universalism.
Yes, this is the absolute key to the whole Nordic welfare state. Before this, welfare was often means-tested. It was just for the poor, which created stigma.
Right.
The Kanslergate Agreement cemented the principle that social benefits, pensions, sick pay, child allowances are rights of citizenship. Everyone gets them, regardless of income. This got the middle class to buy in and defend the welfare state as their own, not just as a handout to the poor.
Okay, now to Norway. They set up their workplace democracy early with the Hovdavtalen in 1935, but their big structural shift comes later, when they find oil in the North Sea.
Right. And Norway faced the classic resource curse. How do you handle this sudden flood of wealth without it leading to corruption, inflation, and just total economic dependency on one thing?
And their solution was radical.
It was radically collectivist, even though it was market-based. They socialized the wealth.
Which led to the creation of the Government Pension Fund Global, GPFG, in 1990, the Norwegian Oil Fund.
It's now the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world,
over $1.5 trillion. The principle is collective ownership. Instead of just handing out the money or letting it flood the domestic economy, they invested it globally. They now own about 1.5% of all listed company shares in the world.
But the real genius, as the sources point out, is the rule that governs how they use it, the Handlingsregeln.
The budgetary rule, absolutely. It's all about intergenerational equity. It limits the government to spending only the expected real return of the fund each year, which is set at about 3%. The capital itself is basically untouched.
What does that do?
It prevents inflation, it protects the economy from oil price swings, and it makes sure the wealth benefits future generations, not just the one that pulled it out of the ground. It's a massive self-renewing savings account for the entire welfare state.
And finally, Finland. They provide this really powerful, tangible symbol of this whole universal commitment, the baby box.
The Finnish maternity package. It started in 1938 for low-income mothers to fight high infant mortality. But the key moment was 1949, when they made it universal.
So every single expectant mother gets one.
Every single one, regardless of wealth. It's full of clothes, bedding, hygiene products, and the box itself can be used as the baby's first crib.
It seems like such a simple thing. What makes it so significant?
It's the physical manifestation of that universalist promise.
Yeah.
Every child, no matter their background, is recognized by the state and deserves an equal, high-quality start in life. The contents have changed over the years. They've added condoms, bra pads, things like that. But the core principle of public support with the cost of raising children has never wavered.
Okay, so we've traced the long historical arc from a 16th century critique to 20th century institutions. Now let's bring it all together by comparing the final policy architecture with the U.S. model. And the differences start, as we said at the beginning, with a completely different idea of what liberty even means.
It's the core divide. The U.S. is rooted in a tradition that emphasizes negative liberty. That's freedom from things, freedom from state interference, freedom from high taxes. This view basically accepts that individual risk is a necessary cost of having a free market and personal autonomy.
And we should acknowledge the argument there. The idea is that low regulation and low taxes spark competition and innovation, which, in theory, lifts everyone up.
That's the rationale, yes. The Nordic countries, coming from that Folkhemmet idea, emphasize positive liberty. That's freedom to do things, freedom to act, to reach your full potential.
So their argument is that a platform of social rights guaranteed healthcare education is actually what makes individual freedom meaningful.
Exactly. If you're constantly terrified of going bankrupt because you get sick, your liberty to start a business or go to school is pretty limited. They see institutional solidarity as the enabler of freedom, not something that restricts it.
Let's see how this plays out in the labor market. In the U.S., it's an at-will employment model. The worker is basically on their own and bears all the risk of a downturn.
And the whole structure reflects that. U.S. union density is, around 10%? You rely on these low statutory minimum wage laws. The Nordic structure is all about collective power. Union density is between 65% and 90%. Wages are set by collective bargaining, which creates a much higher wage floor.
And that high union power is often held up by a really clever mechanism called the Ghent system. How does that work?
The Ghent system is an ingenious link between Social Security and union membership. It means that the state-subsidized unemployment insurance funds are actually run by the trade unions themselves.
So unlike in the U.S. where you go to a state office.
Right. Here, the unions are the gatekeepers to your unemployment benefits. This creates this powerful, immediate reason for almost every worker to join a union. Your membership is directly tied to your income security, and that gives the unions massive leverage in negotiations.
And that security is what allows a country like Denmark to have a system like flexicurity, which would seem incredibly harsh in the U.S.
Flexicurity is the perfect example of positive liberty in the labor market. It has three parts. First, high flexibility. Employers can hire and fire people pretty easily, so the economy can adapt fast.
So far, that sounds very American.
But then comes part two, high security. The state provides incredibly generous unemployment benefits, often up to 90% of your lost income for 2 years. And third, active policy. Mandatory retraining, education, and job search support. The high security part is what makes the high flexibility part politically possible.
Moving to healthcare, the divergence is just stark. In the U.S., you can get great medical treatment, but it can come with a financial catastrophe. 41% of adults have medical debt, even if they have insurance, because of deductibles and copays.
The Nordic goal is just completely different. It's to make healthcare risk a public problem, to eliminate the threat of personal financial ruin. They use tax-funded systems with very hard cost caps.
Look at Norway's system.
Tell us about their exemption card, the Frikort.
The Frikort is literally a financial shield. Once a Norwegian pays about 3,165 kroner, that's roughly $300 in user fees for the year, they get this card.
And then what?
And then every doctor visit, specialist treatment, hospital stay, prescription, everything for the rest of the year is completely free.
A $300 annual cap, but I mean, that's just an astonishing number compared to a typical U.S. deductible of $5,000 or more.
And Sweden has the same thing. They call it high-cost protection. Medical visits are capped at about $135 a year, and prescriptions at about $280. The political agreement is that medical bankruptcy just shouldn't exist as a social phenomenon. The cost of living is high, but the cost of existing is low.
This idea of socializing risk is maybe most obvious in family policy, which the sources call socializing the cost of reproduction. In the U.S., having a kid is treated like a private luxury that you have to finance yourself.
And you see the results. The FMLA in the U.S. gives you 12 weeks of unpaid leave. Only about a quarter of workers get any paid leave at all. It forces these impossible choices on parents.
Whereas Sweden's commitment is in a different universe. 480 days of paid leave per child, paid at about 80% of your income. But they also use it to engineer gender equality.
That's the daddy quota. Out of those 480 days, 90 days are reserved for each parent. Use it or lose it. And this isn't just a nice perk, it's a structural policy to force fathers to take leave, to normalize shared parenting, and, crucially, to reduce hiring discrimination against women.
Because employers can't just assume the woman's going to take all the time off.
Exactly. They know the father is legally required to take a big chunk of it, too.
And the childcare system completes this loop. U.S. childcare is a crippling expense, often more than college tuition.
In Sweden and Denmark, it's a public right. Sweden caps the fees at 3% of family income, with the maximum cost being around $140 a month for the first kid. And this creates what economists call a virtuous cycle.
How so?
By providing affordable, high-quality childcare, the state gets incredibly high female labor force participation, over 80%. Those women are working and paying taxes, which in turn funds the generous parental leave and childcare system in the first place. The investment pays for itself.
Let's talk education. The contrast between a civil right and a consumer good is so clear here. The U.S. system creates massive student debt, averaging around $30,000, even $40,000.
The Nordic model starts with tuition-free university for all citizens. But they go further than that because they know tuition is only half the problem. They also address the cost of living. In Denmark, the state actually pays you to go to school.
It pays you to be a student.
Yes. The Danish SU grant gives students a monthly stipend, not a loan, of about $900 for living expenses. They recognize that free tuition doesn't help if you still have to work 30 hours a week just to pay rent.
And Norway has a hybrid model to encourage people to graduate.
Right. Norway's system gives you a loan, but up to 40% of that loan is forgiven. It's turned into a grant if you graduate successfully. It encourages responsibility, but gets rid of that punitive debt cycle.
Okay, let's wrap up with pensions. Old age security is a political fight everywhere, but Sweden seems to have built a system that's both insulated and resilient.
That's their notional defined contribution, or NDC, system. The word notional is key. It means that while your benefits are linked to your lifetime contributions, kind of like a private account, there's no actual pot of money with your name on it. It's still a public pay-as-you-go system.
So if the account balance is just notional, how does the system stay solvent? How do you stop politicians from promising too much?
With the balance mechanism, this is an automatic adjuster. If the system's assets, the future tax base, fall below its liabilities, the promised payouts, the benefits are automatically adjusted downwards. It's transparent, it's automatic, and it keeps politicians from making promises the economy can't keep.
And Norway, of course, doesn't just have to rely on taxes. They have that giant collective savings account, the GPFG, insulating their system.
Exactly. The oil fund acts as this enormous multi-trillion-dollar buffer. It's backed by global investments, which means Norway can handle demographic shifts and global recessions better than almost anyone. Their wealth is diversified and managed for the long term. So, when you look back across this entire journey from Thomas More in 1516 identifying private property as the problem, all the way to Norway creating the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund in 1990, the thread is pretty clear.
What's the thread?
It's the pursuit of a system that tries to maximize human potential while minimizing existential risk. The Nordic model is really the durable, humane adaptation of socialist ideals, but it was achieved through decades of class compromise, like at Socialism, choosing democratic reform over revolution.
And the sources make this argument so compellingly. This isn't some economic miracle that happened by chance or because of cultural homogeneity. It was a conscious, painful institutional construction. It was a profound act of taming competitive capitalism.
And the final connection we have to make is that a highly competitive, globalized economy is demonstrably not the opposite of high taxes and strong safety nets. In the Nordic world, they're complementary. By institutionalizing solidarity through things like flexicurity and universal childcare, they created a workforce that is secure, flexible, and highly skilled.
And therefore highly productive.
Exactly. They structurally minimize the risk of individual failure, which, paradoxically, allowed the entire economy to embrace more risk and be more dynamic.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you navigate your own society? The history we've traced really reveals this profound philosophical split on the meaning of freedom. Negative liberty versus positive liberty. If the structure of society truly determines the quality of our lives, if, as Moore first suggested, our legal arrangements actually produce our consciousness, then you have to ask yourself, what is the true total cost, not just financial, but social and psychological, of prioritizing individualized risk over institutionalized solidarity? That is the thought we'll leave you to mull over as you see the world through this new historical and economic lens.